Over the past 4 years, Dr. Annmarie Adams and I have collaborated on 3 research creation projects that explore the connections between gardens and the women who built, used, or inspired them. This work is archival, historical, and creative. The archival and historical research is challenging. As Diane Harris and Thaisa Way have noted, gardens are highly ephemeral forms of cultural production, which tend to merit less attention than buildings in terms of preservation. Garden documentation is scarce, and it's often difficult to convey in words alone what gardens were like as affective and sensorial spaces. Thus, we've used creative means to bridge the gap between past and present in our research. In today's paper, we present and launch a collaboratively produced digital model of a garden in order to explore the outside of a modern architectural icon, the Cormier House in Montreal. We'd like to acknowledge the significant collaboration of Zoe Cope, Kaylin Pybus, and Chidem Talou, who co-created our 20-minute film, stills of which you will see during this presentation, including the one on screen, and would like to acknowledge the Gail and Stephen A. Jaroslawski Institute for Studies in Creative Art, Canadian Art, which supported this work. We began with this image of Clarence and Cécile Perron from the 1930s, pictured in an unnamed garden in Montreal. These sisters and artists' models posed for this playful photograph and other works of art for architect Ernest Cormier and artists in his circle. Here the sisters laugh, raise their skirts, showing silk stockings and matching shoes. They mirror each other's poses, an effect that is intensified by the doubling of the duo's image in the reflecting pool below, and the delicate young trees on either side. Clarence and Cécile Perron would live with Ernest Cormier in the Cormier House for 35 years. What role did they play in the garden's creation, we wondered.
This question brought us to what is perhaps Canada's most important Art Deco residence. Located at 1418 Pine Avenue, the building was, from 1930 until 1975, the home of architect Ernest Cormier, who designed the house to suit his non-traditional relationship with Clarence and Cécile Perron. On the left, we see the facade of the house, and on the right, a professional shot of Cormier's studio on that same level from the early 30s. These images express the house's arrangement, scale, and elegance. Our new work builds on Making Himself at Home, Cormier, Trudeau, and the Architecture of Domestic Masculinity, that Cameron McDonough and I published in Winter Tour Portfolio in 2016. We argued that masculinity was a powerful theme in the building's design, symbolism, and reception, well into the era when Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau took ownership in 1979, the year that our current Prime Minister turned 8. It remains in the Trudeau family today. In our article, Cameron and I noted the unusual familial arrangements of both the Cormiers and the Trudeaus, an unmarried threesome and a single father-led family of boys, respectively, and described it as, quote, an upside down and backwards house. Its main entrance, tiny kitchen, dining room, and Cormier's studio are at street level, and the other living areas cascade down the site's steep gradient to the garden below. Unlike Cormier's windowless library, the Perron sisters' apartment looked out over the extraordinary garden. The Cormier-Perron trio lavished attention and expense on the garden. A wonderfully detailed plan from 1941, archived at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, enumerates over 1,000 plants across 69 species. Receipts in the CCA's Cormier Fund show that thousands of dollars were spent on the garden during the Great Depression. A large lawn, floral borders, a rose garden, and an herb garden comprise the landscape. Despite the care and resources that went into it, scholarship on the property has focused on the house.
For all these reasons, and inspired by user-based architectural history, we set out to find archival traces of the sisters' presence in this landscape. This was not the first time that our research on women and historic gardens resulted in creative outcomes. In 2018, at the Colby Curtis Museum in Stansted, Quebec, we produced an exhibition about the museum's garden, which once was a focal point in the lives of 3 generations of Colby family women. This private house became an important regional museum, but the original planting and layout of the garden has not survived. Using archival photographs, letters, gardening books, and seed catalogs, as well as the decoration of the house itself, we found rich evidence of what Annmarie called the floral universe of these women. I produced a series of paintings that explored ways that flowers were an affective part of the Colby women's daily lives, their communication with one another, and how they shaped their home over time. On screen is one painting from this series, which combines elements from photographs and letters to show interspecies relationships in this special place. Similarly, we produced an exhibit that developed from a collaboration with a community center in Montreal's Milton Park neighborhood, where I had an artist residency in 2019. In that project, our interest was the historic garden behind the Notman House on Sherbrooke Street, home of the famous photographer, but which for most of its existence had actually served the residents of a private nursing home for women. Just before my residency, the garden had been saved from destruction thanks to community activism. We worked with archival photographs as well as interviews with activists and one of the women who cared for the garden in its heyday to better understand this landscape's history. And you see here a painting that depicts 8 species that grew in the garden alongside several activists who fought to save both the buildings and the garden. So, as with Stansted, an art exhibit was our creative research output. And we'll just say that a highlight of this project was sharing the final paintings with the community who helped to preserve this site via an exhibition at the nearby School of Architecture at McGill University.
Well, much as we had enjoyed these projects, we were still keen to research a garden through its plants. In 2020, when the opportunity presented itself to work on the Cormier garden, we set out to do exactly that, hoping to find traces of the Perron sisters. Guided by the incredible plan in the CCA collection, our McGill PhD student researchers created a spreadsheet for every plant named and went through Cormier's collection of hundreds of books to single out volumes on plants, gardens, and horticulture. Kale and Pybus took the lead in creating a digital model of the garden and exterior of the house, working with Chidem Talou and Zoe Cope to envision the ways that the garden would have changed through the seasons. In addition, we studied the symbolism and cultural history of select plants in the garden, linking them to design elements of the house and to what we knew of the family living within. There were few direct traces of the sisters' intervention in the garden. We did find receipts that showed Chloranthe Perron, or Mrs. Cormier as written here, did purchase plants for the garden. And there are old black and white films in the CCA collection showing the residents and their guests enjoying the garden. Tantalizingly but inconclusively, we learned that the tenant who had occupied the house between the Cormiers and the Trudeaus, that Chloranthe Perrin had wanted to return to the garden after the sale of the Cormier house to dig up her favorite plant. But we have been unable to verify this anecdote. What we did find in the Cormier garden was a romantic floral drama foregrounding death and rebirth through love. The plants themselves narrated this drama. Asters symbolize patience and love. Columbine stand for faithfulness, but also forsaken affections, while the cornflower was traditionally worn by young men in love. Roses, associated since Western antiquity with love, were at the heart of this small landscape. And rhododendrons, the flower that Chloranthe Perron purchased in 1931, represent both steadfast love and mourning, reminding us that she and Cormier would marry in 1976, just a few years before Cormier's death in 1980.
The Cormier garden is a romantic vision, but what about the women who appear to have been its inspiration? In a 1932 RAIC article, the Perron sisters' space within the house was described, or perhaps we should say dismissed, as the quote, housekeeper's suite. Working against this erasure, our film insists upon the sisters' presence and the entwining of their story with that of the Cormier house and garden. In this way, Florence and Cécile Perron conjure, in the words of theorist Elizabeth Graz, quote, the outside that architecture requires but cannot contain, end quote. Something like sisters ourselves, Annmarie and I bring complementary interests and experiences to each collaboration, insisting on accessible creative production as a way of sharing our research and these magnificent gardens. By way of conclusion, we share with you the URL where you can access the final version of our film, now in French with English subtitles. And so we invite you all to spend time in the Cormier Garden, a compelling Art Deco floral universe.